The fluorescent lights hummed their 60 Hz song above the Portland night, a sound most people stopped hearing after their first shift. Megan O'Brien never stopped hearing it. The hum was data, background noise that told her the electrical system was stable, the HVAC was running, the hospital was breathing. She moved through Mercy General's emergency department like water finding its level, present but unobtrusive, her navy scrubs a shade darker than everyone else's, though no one had ever remarked on this. 3 years. That's how long she'd been a civilian nurse at Mercy General. Her personnel file showed nothing but competence, never late, never sick, never a complaint filed in either direction. There was a 5-year gap before that, year she'd attributed to caring for a sick parent. No one had questioned it. No one questioned Megan O'Brien about anything, which was precisely how she'd engineered it. Her locker was in the northeast corner of the break room, 3rd shelf from the bottom. She opened it at 10:53 p.m., exactly 13 minutes before the start of her graveyard shift, and her fingers found the pair of worn combat boots resting on a folded towel. The leather was scarred with sand that had never quite washed out, even after 3 years of civilian life. Baghdad dust. She touched them, just the toe of the left boot, thumb against the crease, a ritual as automatic as breathing. Her hand was steady. It had to be. The shift briefing began at 11 p.m. in the ED conference room, a rectangular space where the morning coffee had curdled into something closer to battery acid. Megan sat in the 3rd chair from the door, her posture erect but not rigid, her face arranged in the expression of polite neutrality she'd perfected. The charge nurse, Patricia, was already talking about census. They'd admitted 14 patients since 7 a.m., discharged 6, and there were 4 more coming via ambulance from a multi-vehicle collision on I-5 northbound. "We're going to be slammed," Patricia said, and Megan registered the data, for additional traumas meant the critical care beds would fill within the hour, meaning overflow into the overflow, meaning every staff member would be triaged by competence rather than specialty. She'd be moving fast. She preferred moving fast. The morning shift left at 7 a.m. The night shift was Megan's, had been Megan since she'd started at Mercy General, because she'd offered to take the worst rotations without complaint. This was strategic. Night shifts meant fewer administrative eyes, fewer layers of hierarchy, fewer people watching her work. Nights meant she could move. Her first assignment was the trauma bays. 3 patients had arrived at 10:16 p.m., 2 stable, 1 unstable. A 43-year-old male with a fractured tibia and a lacerated brachial artery that was bleeding into the soft tissues like a slow-motion catastrophe. The vascular surgeon was en route. Orthopedics was standing by. Megan's job was to keep him alive for 15 minutes until surgery could claim him. She started 2 18-gauge angiocaths in the patient's left arm with movements so economical they looked like sleight of hand. The first 4 was accessed on the initial stick, no fishing, no second attempts. The second one she placed while the first was drawing blood for crossmatch. The attending physician, Dr. Chen, was watching the monitor and barking orders about blood products. "Type and cross, stat," he said. 2 units packed cells, 2 units fresh frozen plasma, 1 unit platelets. Megan was already running the for extension, already crimping off the arterial bleeding with direct pressure and a 4x4 gauze held with precise tension, enough to occlude the bleeding, not enough to compromise the distal circulation. The patient's blood pressure was 108/67. She'd keep it there. She worked silently. No radio chatter, no unnecessary words. Just the beep of the monitor and the sound of the trauma team assembling like a well-oiled engine that didn't need a carburetor. The surgeon arrived at 10:31 p.m. and the patient was in the OR by 10:40. Megan had kept him alive. What happened next didn't immediately announce itself as important. It was a routine moment, the kind that happened in medical education every single day across the country. The morning teaching rounds had run late, as they always did, and Dr. Hargrove, Chief of Emergency Medicine, a man whose office was decorated with degrees from Johns Hopkins and a photograph of himself receiving a Hospital Foundation Award, had decided to conduct his rounds during the evening shift. He preferred an audience of medical students and residents. He preferred teaching. Mostly, he preferred having people around to appreciate his competence. Bed 7 was in the acute care section, the kind of bed reserved for patients who were stable enough to not require critical care, but unstable enough to not be sent to the floor. Corporal James Davis occupied Bed 7. He'd arrived at 4:33 p.m. following a single-vehicle motor vehicle accident on Route 22. His truck had drifted left across the center line and collided head-on with a support column at approximately 45 miles per hour. He'd been extracted by fire department personnel, transported to Mercy General via ambulance, and admitted with multiple contusions, a mild concussion, and a fractured right clavicle. He was 23 years old, muscular in the way young military men were muscular, with dark hair and the kind of stillness that came from training, not medication. Megan was checking his for when Dr. Hargrove arrived with his entourage, 3 medical students and a resident, all trailing behind him like remoras behind a shark. She was adjusting the rate on the 0.9% sodium chloride when she felt his presence shift the air pressure in the room. She didn't look up. She finished what she was doing. "Corporal Davis," Dr. Hargrove was saying, in the kind of voice that wanted to be heard, "your accident was quite fortunate in its outcome. Many C7 fractures with associated neurological injury could have resulted in much more serious." Megan was running normal saline at 125 milliliters per hour. The order had called for 150. The order was wrong. A patient with a mild concussion and stable vital signs didn't need rapid fluid administration. Rapid administration would increase intracranial pressure, which would exacerbate the headache, which would mask the early signs of deterioration if any occurred. The order was not malicious. The order was simply a man in a hurry, a man who'd written it while thinking about other things. But it was wrong. Megan set down the 4 bag. She turned. She met Dr. Hargrove's eyes for exactly 1 second, not longer, which would have been confrontational, not shorter, which would have been evasive. She said, "The fluid rate, Dr. Hargrove." "The order's at 150, but with a concussion, 125 is indicated. Elevated pressure from rapid administration could mask neurological changes." The room went so quiet the ventilator sounds from the neighboring beds became audible, that mechanical whoosh-whoosh of air being forced in and out of sick lungs. Dr. Hargrove's face didn't change. His expression remained exactly as it had been, pleasant and professorial, the expression of a man conducting teaching rounds. But something had shifted behind his eyes. Something had recognized a threat. He was the chief of emergency medicine at a 487-bed regional hospital. He had been in practice for 22 years. He had published research in emergency medicine journals. He had trained more than 200 medical students. And a nurse, a civilian nurse with 3 years at Mercy General and a 5-year employment gap nobody had bothered to investigate, had just corrected him. In front of residents. In front of medical students. In front of Corporal Davis, who was now watching the dynamic with the very still attention of someone trained to observe human behavior. "I believe 150 is appropriate," Dr. Hargrove said, his voice unchanged because he was too experienced to let anything show. But he didn't change the order either. He simply nodded once and continued his rounds, his students trailing behind him like they were tethered. Megan adjusted the 4 rate back to 150 milliliters per hour. She did this without hesitation, without comment, without even the tiniest change in her facial expression. But her hand, for just 1 microsecond, trembled, not from fear, but from the compression of something larger, something that needed to stay compressed, something that had been compressed for 5 years now and would continue to be compressed because that was the covenant she'd made, the agreement that had brought her here. Corporal Davis's eyes followed her across the room. He had the name M. the Bryant tattooed on his left forearm in block letters, the kind of tattoo that meant something. It meant a person mattered enough to carry their name on your skin. When Megan had first seen it, that morning when she'd run his initial for after admission, something in her chest had compressed in a different way. But when she'd looked at his face, she'd seen only a stranger. His eyes were young, unmarked by the things that put names on skin. He'd been sleeping during the incident in Baghdad. He'd been unconscious. He didn't remember. The incident. That was the word the classified briefing had used, because calling it a building collapse was too specific, and calling it her husband's death was something no official document would ever do. Dr. Hargrove and his entourage left the unit at 6:17 p.m. Megan was restocking the supply cart in the medication room when Patricia found her, pulling a bottle of hypertonic saline from the locked cabinet and checking the label against the patient chart. "That was interesting," Patricia said. She was leaning against the counter in the way people did when they had gossip but were still deciding whether to share it. "You correcting Hargrove?" Megan set down the saline bottle. "The order was incorrect." "I know. And you were right. But nobody corrects Hargrove. Not in front of students, anyway. He's particular about authority structures." Megan understood what Patricia meant without needing further elaboration. Authority structures. Hierarchy. The understanding that some people were allowed to speak and others weren't. Megan had spent 5 years becoming someone who didn't speak unless spoken to, whose competence was expressed entirely through work, whose presence was something people felt in the room only as a sense of things getting done without explanation. The incident, the word returned to her unbidden, had taught her that visibility was danger. That authority was a weapon. That the quietest person in the room was often the safest. She didn't respond to Patricia. She finished checking the medication and returned to the unit. Bed 7's for ran at 150 milliliters per hour, and Corporal Davis's concussion headache intensified over the course of the evening, and Megan documented his symptoms and reported them to the attending, and the attending ordered a repeat CT scan to rule out intracranial bleed, and the scan came back negative, and she documented that too, all of it following protocol, all of it following orders, all of it the work of a nurse who kept her head down and did what she was told. At 11:43 p.m., during the night shift's deepest hours when the hospital was a different creature altogether, quieter, darker, more honest, Megan was standing at the break room refrigerator looking for the coffee she'd brought from home. She found it on the second shelf, past the take-out containers with unlabeled dates and the energy drink can stacked like aluminum bones. She was turning to leave when she heard voices from the adjacent lounge, where the attending physicians sometimes gathered to pretend they weren't exhausted. He was furious, someone was saying. "I've never seen Hargrove actually angry. He covers it better than that." "What happened?" The nurse on the night shift corrected his medication order during rounds. In front of medical students. Called him out on fluid administration rates. "Which nurse?" "The quiet one. O'Brien. The one who takes all the night shifts." There was a pause. The kind of pause that meant someone was trying to remember a face they hadn't bothered to study. "He made a bet in the break room about an hour ago," the first voice continued. "Said she'd quit within a week. He literally said if she can't handle the hierarchy, she shouldn't be here." Megan stood very still. The coffee was cold in her hands. The fluorescent light above the refrigerator hummed its 60 Hz song, and she registered the data again: electrical stability, AFAC stability, the hospital breathing. She had lived 5 years on the principle of being invisible. She had accepted every insult and every slight and every moment of being treated as less than competent because invisibility was survival. She had worn scrubs like camouflage and touched combat boots for courage and kept her husband's grave unmarked because marked graves were found and names on headstones led to questions. But now the game had changed. Because she'd made a mistake. Because she'd spoken up. Because there was a Marine in bed 7 with her husband's name tattooed on his forearm, and she'd saved his life, and he didn't know it. And in the break room, somewhere in the building, Dr. Hargrove was making bets about her departure, consolidating his power structure, preparing to accelerate the systematic destruction of someone he decided was a threat to his authority. The break room at Mercy General smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness that accumulates when no one cares enough to open a window. Dr. Hargrove sat at the head of the table like he'd been assigned the seat at birth, 3 attending physicians and 2 residents arranged around him in descending order of seniority. This was how power worked in his world: hierarchies nested inside hierarchies, each person knowing exactly where they stood, exactly who could humiliate them without consequence. "That O'Brien woman thinks she's smarter than me," Hargrove said, stirring his coffee with slow, deliberate rotations. The spoon clinked against the ceramic. Clink. 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 The sound of someone used to being listened to. I'll bet anyone here $50 she quits within a week. The martyred nurse routine only works until someone calls her on it. One of the residents, a thin man with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes, leaned forward. She's got that act down perfect, sir. Real gracious, takes every shift nobody else wants. But that's the giveaway, isn't it? Nobody works like that unless they're hiding something. Exactly, Hargrove said, and his voice had the texture of gravel, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who'd spent 23 years believing his own authority was synonymous with competence. A real nurse knows her place. Respects the chain of command. This one? She sees herself as above it somehow. The other attending physician, older, with silver threading through his hair, nodded along. I've seen her correct medication calculations. On the floor. In front of students. In front of students, Hargrove repeated, as if this was the greatest sin imaginable. That's insubordination dressed up as patient safety. I won't have it. They all murmured agreement, the sound of men who had never been questioned, never been found inadequate, never considered that their certainty might be a cage. Megan pushed open the break room door at 1,247 hours. She'd learned to think in military time, even after 3 years of pretending it didn't matter, and the room went dead silent. The coffee maker gurgled behind her. Someone's pager buzzed. Dr. Hargrove's smile spread across his face like something alive and predatory, and he turned to her with the confidence of a man who'd never faced consequences. Ah, there she is, he said softly. We were just discussing professional boundaries, sweetheart. Something you might want to learn. Apparently correcting attendings in front of medical students is considered ambitious. Megan stood in the doorway for exactly one breath. The fluorescent light overhead cast everything in the hospital pallor, the kind of light that made everyone look equally sick. She could have apologized. She could have walked out. She could have done what she'd been trained to do for the first phase of her civilian life, disappear, accept, become invisible. Instead, she met his eyes. Hers were steady as a rifle scope. I learned boundaries in places you couldn't survive, doctor. The room seemed to compress. One of the residents actually exhaled sharply, a small sound of shock. Hargrove's jaw tightened, but he just smiled wider, the expression becoming something that looked like a threat. Get yourself a sandwich and think about how that comment's going to look in your personnel file. She didn't respond. She moved to the refrigerator, her hands perfectly steady, and retrieved her lunch. The silence followed her out like humidity. That was the thing about composure, people could sense it. They could sense when they'd thrown their worst at someone and it hadn't stuck. 2 days later, the cafeteria at Mercy General was crowded with the lunch crowd, nurses in various states of exhaustion, residents trying to choke down something before their next crisis, administrators in clothes that cost more than staff nurses made in a week. Megan carried a tray with a salad and the kind of protein bar that tastes like resignation, navigating toward a corner table where she could sit alone and not think about anything except getting through the next 12 hours. Dr. Hargrove sat at the doctor's table, 3 colleagues around him. As she passed, his foot extended slightly into the aisle, just enough that when he looked away, his timing seemed perfect, his movement appeared completely accidental. Megan's tray tilted. Her hands were fast enough to almost save it, muscle memory pulling at her shoulders, but she let it happen. She'd learned that fighting back in public only made things worse. The tray fell. Food scattered across the linoleum in a pattern almost beautiful, the arc of dressing, the spin of a roll, the soft splatter of yogurt. She knelt immediately, her movements controlled and efficient, picking up pieces with her bare hands because she'd learned long ago not to draw attention by asking for help. Better stick to bedpans, one of the residents called out. The table erupted in laughter. A medical student nearby pretended to look at her phone, the particular kind of deliberate non-witnessing that meant everyone was watching. Megan stayed on her knees. She picked up each piece of food with methodical care, her hands steady as surgical hands, her breathing the same as it had been in rubble with rounds coming, as it had been holding pressure on a lacerated femoral artery with nothing but field dressings and prayers. One tear escaped her right eye, just one, let it fall without breaking her expression, then she wiped her face with the back of her wrist without making eye contact with anyone. "You need help?" a younger nurse asked quietly, already crouching beside her. "I've got it," Megan said, her voice exactly level. "Thank you though." She stood, set her empty tray on the counter, and walked back to the unit. Behind her, the cafeteria gradually returned to normal, conversations resuming, phones buzzing, the ambient noise of people who'd already forgotten what they'd just witnessed. That was how cruelty worked in institutions. It was ordinary. It was normalized. It was easy. That night on rounds, Megan checked Corporal Davis's vitals, blood pressure 118/72, heart rate steady at 68, oxygen saturation 97% on room air. He was healing well from the car accident, his fractured ribs knitting, his lung function returning to normal. She adjusted his added fluid to his hanging bag, movements economical and practiced. His voice was cautious, the voice of someone still measuring people by what they showed him. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said. "You ever serve?" "Military, I mean." He was watching her hands as they worked, watching how she moved, how she checked his lines. "You move like someone who—" "I don't know." "Like you know what you're doing with wounded people." Megan's hands paused for exactly half a second. The line was secure. The medication flowing at the correct rate. Everything was fine. "No," she said. "Just a nurse." "Because I got this tattoo," he continued, lifting his forearm. The ink was faded, done in Baghdad by someone who worked out of a building that probably doesn't exist anymore. The Brian. His father's name. His name, too, since his mother took her maiden name back. My old man was there. 2009, Fallujah and then Ramadi. Said the medics, the combat medics, I mean, they were like angels. Saved guys who should have died. Megan finished checking his chart, her pen moving across the page with deliberate care. "Your father was lucky to have people who knew what they were doing." "Yeah," Corporal Davis said softly. "He came home because of them. Spent my whole life telling me about this one SEAL, senior chief, I think. Woman. Said she held up a building with her own hands while they pulled wounded Marines out. Sounds like a story, right? But my dad, he doesn't lie about stuff like that." The pen in Megan's hand didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She set it down on the counter and turned to him with a smile that was perfectly professional and perfectly empty. "That sounds like someone who loved what they did." "You okay, "Perfectly fine, Corporal. Your vitals look excellent. You're healing exactly on schedule." She adjusted his blanket, the motion maternal and automatic. "Try to get some rest." She left his room and walked to the nurse's station where the evening shift was fully engaged, phone ringing, patients calling for assistance, the constant low-level chaos of an emergency department that never actually slowed down. Dr. Hargrove appeared at the desk shortly after, his presence preceding him like a pressure change, like the air was suddenly too dense to breathe. "I need to discuss a concern with hospital administration," he said, loud enough that the nurses around the desk could hear. Loud enough that it mattered who was listening. "Some of the clinical decisions on your recent cases are going to need formal review. Nothing personal. Just procedure." Megan was charting Corporal Davis's vitals into the system. Her fingers didn't pause on the keyboard. Her posture didn't shift. "Of course, Doctor. Whenever administration is ready." "That's good to hear," he said. His smile was a weapon. "I'm sure there's a completely reasonable explanation for everything." He turned to leave, pausing at the end of the counter. "And Megan? That comment you made in the break room about where I couldn't survive? That's the kind of attitude that ends nursing careers. Just so you're clear." The other nurses were watching now, the way people watch to see how you respond to a threat. Megan closed out her chart entry and looked up at him. Her eyes were the color of storm water over dark rocks. "I think I'll be fine, Doctor." He laughed, a sound like ice cracking, and walked away. What he didn't know, as he left the unit and started making phone calls to the hospital board president, to the handful of references Megan had listed, to the outside consultants he knew who owed him favors, was that he'd already set something in motion. He'd already started pulling threads on a woman whose entire life had been constructed around being invisible, around staying buried, around letting the past stay dead. He didn't know that somewhere in a locked box in an attic in Portland, there were photographs he would never see until it was far too late. 3 nights stretched between the cafeteria incident and the moment everything accelerated. Megan worked the graveyard shift at Mercy General, the skeleton crew that ran between midnight and 6 in the morning when the hospital became a different creature, quieter, more honest, stripped of its daytime pretense. The fluorescent panels hummed their mechanical lullaby. Beds filled with the restless and dying. And Corporal Davis slept in bed 7 with his dislocated shoulder wrapped tight, healing increments each day, his tattoo still visible on his left forearm, M. the Brian, letters etched in Baghdad ink. He'd asked her twice about that name. Both times she'd answered with professional distance, just a patient name, nothing more, and he'd stopped asking, accepting the boundary like the disciplined Marine he was. At 2:44 a.m., the monitor alarm screamed. Not a gentle notification. Not a warning beep. A full auditory assault that yanked Megan's head up from the charting station where she'd been documenting vitals. The sound cut through the hallway like a siren through fog. She was moving before the second alarm pulse, her body already knowing what her mind hadn't yet confirmed. Bed 7. His room. The door swung open and hit the wall with a hollow thud that echoed down the corridor. Corporal Davis was gasping. Not breathing, gasping, the kind of sucking inhalation that meant the body was desperate, oxygen-starved, fighting for air it couldn't reach. His chest heaved asymmetrically, the right side moving with labored effort while the left side lagged half a beat behind, collapsed inward like a deflated sail. His neck twisted slightly, and Megan's eyes found the trachea deviating left, the windpipe pushing away from center, compressed by something building pressure inside his thoracic cavity. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung creating a one-way valve, air getting in but not getting out, pressure mounting with each breath he took, compressing the lung further, pressing against the heart, strangling the vessels that fed it. 2 minutes. Maybe less. Dr. Chen, the on-call resident, stood 3 feet from the bed, hands half-raised as if unsure whether to touch anything, his face the color of wet concrete. 26 years old, fresh out of medical school 6 months prior, brilliant on paper, useless in the moment. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again without sound. Megan was already moving. Gloves snapped on like gunshots in the compressed air of the room. She was at the supply cart, hand steady as surgical steel, pulling a 14-gauge angiocath needle, large bore, fast flow, exactly what the moment required. The needle gleamed under the hard light. Her fingers found the anatomical landmarks without hesitation, the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line, the precise point where physics and anatomy intersected. He needs authorization, Chen stammered, his voice climbing in pitch. We have to wait for Dr. Hargrove's approval. Protocol requires. He'll be dead in 90 seconds. Megan's voice was level water, no tension, no edge, just facts stated and absorbed. She prepped the site with antiseptic, and the sharp smell of alcohol cut through the stale hospital air. I need a chest tube kit at bedside. You can't, that's not within nursing scope. The needle went in. Through skin. Through subcutaneous tissue. Through the parietal pleura with a subtle resistance that translated directly through her fingers. She could feel it the way a violinist feels the exact moment a string reaches perfect pitch. And then, the hiss. Air escaping. Pressure releasing. The single most beautiful sound in emergency medicine, the rush of escaped atmosphere that meant survival, meant reprieve, meant the terrible mathematics of the moment had been answered. Davis gasped again, but this time his chest rose symmetrically. The left side expanded. The trachea began to shift back toward midline. His oxygen saturation monitor changed its rhythm, no longer the panicked staccato of a drowning man, but the steady progression of someone returning to the surface. 88, 91, 94. Megan was already reaching for the second line, securing the needle with tape, her fingers applied with the precision of someone who'd done this not in simulation, not in controlled educational environments, but in the particulate dust and gunfire and mortality of a forward operating base where mistakes meant flag-draped caskets and letters to mothers. The muscle memory wasn't just in her hands. It lived in the space between her ribs, in the architecture of her nervous system, in the deep reptilian brain that knew how to save lives when everything was collapsing. Get me a chest tube tray. Large bore. And call trauma. She wasn't asking. The voice had shifted, no longer the deferential nurse asking permission, but someone issuing commands with the quiet authority of experience. Call them now. Chen moved. Finally. His feet obeyed even if his mind was still catching up, still processing how a bedside nurse had performed a procedure that belonged in the domain of critical care physicians, how her hands had known exactly where to go and what to do, how she'd just saved a Marine's life by stepping outside every boundary that defined her civilian identity. Davis's eyes opened. Confused. Gasping still, but the terror was fading from his pupils. Consciousness returning. His hand reached for the rail, and Megan was there immediately, placing her palm against his forearm, not touching me not blocking access, just a single point of contact that said, "You're alive, you're back, you're going to walk out of this. Stay still, Corporal." His eyes focused on her face. "You just had a collapsed lung. We're going to take care of it now." Recognition flickered across his features. Not understanding, the kind that came from 2 weeks of watching her move through his care, watching how she worked with the same economical precision as the corpsmen who'd patched him up at Ramadi. His mouth moved. No sound. Just the shape of a question he was too medicated and oxygen-deprived to voice. But his eyes held hers for 3 seconds, and in that space was something that looked like acknowledgement, like he'd just seen something in her that he'd been searching for since Baghdad. The trauma team arrived at 2:54 a.m. 7 minutes after the alarm. The room filled with bodies and competence, with attending physicians and surgical nurses and the machinery of institutional response. The chest tube was placed with textbook precision, this time by people with credentials that matched their actions. Megan stepped back into the shadows of the room, gloves peeled off and disposed of, her role condensed into a single sentence of handoff, tension pneumothorax on the right, decompressed at 2:44, stable on supplemental oxygen, vitals improving. She didn't mention that she'd performed the decompression. The trauma team didn't ask. By 3:15 a.m., Corporal Davis was headed to the ICU with a chest tube in place and a trauma surgeon booking the first available OR slot. Megan finished her documentation, her hands moving through the charting process with the same automaticity that had guided the needle. Each note precise, each action recorded, each vital sign documented in the institutional record that would become part of his permanent medical history. She didn't sleep the rest of the shift. She worked the remaining hours with the kind of focus that erases everything peripheral, checking on other patients, restocking the supply cart, moving through the dimly lit corridors of Mercy General like a ghost who had somewhere to be but no hurry to get there. At 6:44 a.m., as the day shift began its arrival, Megan clocked out. She didn't see Dr. Hargrove enter the administrative wing 20 minutes later, moving with the purposeful stride of a man who'd just been handed everything he needed. But that wasn't the worst part. By 7:15 a.m., Dr. Hargrove was sitting in his office with the hospital's IT security footage pulled up on his desktop monitor. The video was grainy, black and white, the angle from the ceiling-mounted camera directly above bed 7. He watched it once. Twice. 3 times, freezing the frame at the precise moment when Megan's hands positioned the needle, when she performed a procedure that existed in the liminal space between nursing and medicine, between protocol and survival. Her hands moving with absolute certainty. No hesitation. No checking with anyone. Just action, muscle memory made visible, the kind of technical precision that you didn't learn from a nursing textbook or a community college clinical rotation. He saw his opening crystallize in real time. Hargrove's fingers moved across his keyboard with the certainty of a man who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. The email composed itself in his mind before his fingers touched the keys. To the hospital board, subject line, immediate scope of practice violation, senior staff member. He attached the video. Included 3 still frames where Megan's movements were clearest. Wrote a preliminary assessment that carefully omitted the fact that his patient was alive because of those exact movements, that the Marine was breathing because of something that lived outside the boundaries of what a nurse should be capable of performing. Instead, Hargrove wrote about risk. About liability. About the hospital's exposure if word got out that staff were performing procedures outside their scope. About how this could have gone very differently. About how they were lucky, but luck wasn't a policy. He hit send at 7:42 a.m., and Megan O'Brien's carefully constructed invisible life began to crack along fault lines she'd been trying to seal for 5 years. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Dr. Hargrove didn't sleep that night. At 7:42 a.m., his finger hovered over his phone's call log, and he began methodically dismantling the woman who'd embarrassed him in front of medical students. The hospital board president answered on the third ring, groggy, irritated at being called before 8 on a Saturday morning. "Richard. It's Dr. Hargrove. We have a scope of practice violation that needs immediate attention." His voice carried the smooth confidence of a man who'd never been told no by institutional power. "Your emergency department nurse performed a needle decompression last night without physician oversight. A procedure reserved for trauma surgeons and emergency physicians." The board president sat up. Liability. The word hung between them like a blade. "I have security footage. I have the patient's chart. I'm concerned about our malpractice exposure." Dr. Hargrove's tone suggested concern, but his jaw was tight. This was something else entirely. This was survival. This was the restoration of the hierarchy she'd fractured when she corrected him in front of students. "I'd recommend we initiate an investigation." Quietly. By 9 a.m., Dr. Hargrove had contacted 3 of Megan's 5 references, the ones listed on the civilian nursing application she'd submitted 5 years ago. He asked each of them the same questions, each time with a different inflection, each time with the subtle suggestion that something didn't add up. "She mentions a 5-year gap before nursing school. Family care," she said. "Did she ever elaborate on that? Did you find her credentials were in order? Or were there any gaps? Would you describe her as someone with extensive experience? More than a typical nurse?" The references, a community health clinic in Seattle, a physician's assistant in Spokane, a retired hospice director in Tacoma, all said the same thing: solid nurse, quiet, reliable, no problems. But Dr. Hargrove didn't need them to damn her. He needed them to confirm that the gap existed, that something about her history didn't fit the standard template of a civilian nurse. He needed them to plant the seed of doubt. By Saturday afternoon, he'd hired an outside investigator, a former hospital compliance officer named Martin Kress, a man who understood that institutional self-protection often meant making difficult decisions about personnel. Hargrove sent him the security footage from the emergency department, the patient chart, and a 2-paragraph summary titled, "Scope Violation, Concerning Pattern." "I want to know everything about that 5-year gap," Hargrove told him over the phone. "Her employment history, her movements, why she suddenly appears in Portland with nursing credentials. And I want to know why she's capable of performing military-level medical procedures." Kress nodded. He'd done this before, for hospitals that needed to protect themselves from liability. He began pulling employment records from the state, cross-referencing nursing databases, checking for any prior licenses or certifications that might explain where she'd acquired the knowledge to perform emergency trauma surgery. By Monday morning, the hospital board had scheduled a closed-door investigation for Wednesday afternoon. Dr. Hargrove received a formal email confirming the meeting. He replied within minutes, "I will have a complete documentation package prepared." That documentation package took him 14 hours to compile. Security footage of the needle decompression, timestamped at 2:02 a.m. The patient chart showing Megan's name on the procedure note. A written statement from the on-call resident, a young physician named Dr. Morrison who'd frozen during the crisis, explaining that he'd been unable to perform the procedure and the nurse had taken action without waiting for authorization. A memo from Hargrove himself titled Concerning Pattern of Insubordination, which included his account of her correcting his medication calculation in front of students, noting that this demonstrated a troubling willingness to undermine medical authority and establish chain of command. He included photographs of the break room incident, the moment her lunch tray clattered to the floor, though the photos only showed the tray and the floor, not the context. He included the chart he'd thrown at her feet, photographed as evidence of something. The documentation was impeccable. It told a story that sounded perfectly reasonable to anyone who didn't know the real sequence of events. Hargrove printed all of it in triplicate, bound it in hospital blue folders, and placed them on the conference table Tuesday night, after hours, when no one would see him doing it. Wednesday afternoon arrived with the smell of burnt coffee and the hum of the hospital's aging HVAC system. The board convened in the main conference room on the third floor, a mahogany table, 12 leather chairs, windows overlooking Portland's rain-slicked skyline. 6 board members filed in, along with the hospital's legal counsel, an attorney named Stephen Garrett who specialized in employment law and institutional protection. Dr. Hargrove sat at the head of the table, the blue folders aligned in front of each board member. His tie was expensive, Italian silk. His shoes were polished. He looked like a man who'd never been questioned, never been held accountable, never stood in the rain at a grave in a borrowed coat. Megan sat alone in the hallway outside the conference room, in a plastic chair that squeaked every time she shifted her weight. A security guard named Wilson sat nearby, pretending not to notice her. He'd worked at Mercy General for 8 years. He'd seen her arrive for the night shift in all weather, working holidays without complaint, staying late to help with overflow patients. He'd watched her move through the hallways with a kind of quiet competence that made difficult things look easy. Inside the conference room, Dr. Hargrove began with a recitation of facts, clinical facts, administrative facts, each one carefully curated to support the narrative he'd constructed. The procedure in question was a needle decompression for tension pneumothorax, performed at 2:38 a.m. on a patient in acute respiratory distress. Emergency physicians perform this procedure in Level 1 trauma centers. Registered nurses do not. Board member Patricia Chen, a cardiologist and the board president, leaned forward. Dr. Hargrove, the resident, was unable to perform the procedure. Dr. Morrison froze. Understandable, it's a high-stress situation. The nurse took action without authorization. While I understand her intention was to help the patient, we have scope of practice laws for a reason. Institutional liability is significant. He opened the first blue folder. Security footage. Time-stamped images. The board members looked at each stiff photograph, each one showing Megan's hands moving, the needle going in, the patient's chest rising and falling. She knew exactly what she was doing, Hargrove said. Which raises another concern. He placed a second folder on the table. 5 years ago, this nurse appears in Portland with nursing credentials and no prior employment history. No explanation for what she was doing before that. I've contacted her references, they confirm the gap exists. Attorney Garrett tapped his pen against his notepad. And you're suggesting? I'm suggesting we don't know who she really is. The medical competence she displayed suggests training beyond standard nursing. The 5-year gap suggests something she's not telling us. The willingness to exceed her scope suggests judgment issues. Taken together, we have liability exposure. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a greenish pallor over the table. Chen exchanged glances with the other board members. One of them, a retired CFO named Thomas Wright, nodded slowly. We need to protect the institution, Hargrove said quietly. A statement that we investigated, found a violation, and took corrective action. It demonstrates institutional oversight. It insulates us from liability. The vote took 7 minutes. 5-1 in favor of termination. Only Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, the hospital's chief of obstetrics, voted to delay pending further investigation. Her voice was quiet. We're missing something. I don't think we should rush this. but the other board members had made their calculation. Hargrove had presented evidence. The procedure existed. The scope violation was real. The 5-year gap was real. The rest was just filling in a narrative that protected the hospital. Wilson knocked on the conference room door at 4:17 p.m. "The board is ready for you," he said quietly. Megan stood. Her face was steady, but her hands had developed a tremor, not fear, but the specific vibration of a body that has learned to metabolize panic into action, and now had nothing to act on. She walked into the conference room and saw the blue folders, the expressions of the board members, and understood what had happened. "Ms. O'Brien," Patricia Chen began, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy of institutional authority, "thank you for coming in. We've completed our investigation into the incident last Thursday evening. We have questions about a procedure you performed on Corporal Davis." Megan stood at the end of the table. No one offered her a chair. "You performed a needle decompression. A procedure outside your scope of practice as a registered nurse." "He was going to die," Megan said. Her voice was steady, level, the voice of someone stating facts. "That's not an answer to our question," Garrett interjected. "Where did you learn that procedure? How did you know to perform it? Your nursing education doesn't include that training." Megan's jaw tightened. She couldn't explain. If she explained, if she said the words, "Special Warfare Medical Officer, SEAL Team 3, Baghdad, 2007, the whole careful architecture of her civilian life would collapse. The 5-year disappearance. The sealed records. The explicit instruction that Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien had ceased to exist on paper the moment she'd signed the non-disclosure agreement, the moment she'd been ordered to disappear after the building collapse, after the 12 civilians, after the operation that had to be buried so deep it never existed. She'd promised Marcus she'd keep her head down. She'd promised him on his deathbed, in the hospice room where he'd held her hand for the last time, "Megan, you've got a son. You've got a life. Keep your head down. Don't let the ghosts follow you." "I saved his life," she said finally. "We understand that," Chen said with a gentle tone of someone delivering predetermined judgment. "But this hospital has policies. Scope of practice exists to protect patients. We can't have employees acting outside those parameters, regardless of their intentions." Garrett slid a termination letter across the table. "Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. You'll receive 2-week severance pay and your final check will be processed by Friday. Wilson will escort you out." The letter lay on the table like a blade. Megan didn't touch it. She didn't argue. She didn't ask for an appeal or a hearing or time to find another job. She'd learned long ago that some institutions operated on the principle of institutional self-protection, and once the machinery was in motion, individual appeals meant nothing. She turned and walked out. Wilson was waiting with a cardboard box, her locker contents, her name badge, her final pay stubs. He looked at her face and said quietly, "I'm sorry, Megan. I've watched you work. You're the best we had." 3 days later, rain hammered down on the Portland Memorial Cemetery like artillery fire, relentless, cold, the kind of rain that made the world feel like it was being washed away. Megan stood at Marcus's grave, her shoulders dark with water, her hair plastered to her skull. She held the cardboard box with her civilian nursing license inside. 3 years of night shifts. 3 years of building a life that was supposed to be invisible, untouchable, safe. "I promised you I'd keep my head down, Marcus," she whispered to the rain and the stone. "And I couldn't even do that right." Her hands gripped the edges of the box. The rain dripped from her nose. Behind her, the cemetery stretched out in rows of stones, each one a story of someone who'd tried to hide something, someone who'd failed. 1 week after the hospital delivered her termination box, Megan sat in her car in the parking lot of Mercy General, waiting. She didn't know why she'd come back. The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and gleaming like a mirror of everything she'd tried to bury. Her phone had buzzed that morning with a message from an unknown number, hospital board reconvening. Conference room. 10 a.m. Come. She didn't recognize the sender. She came anyway. The conference room doors stood at the far end of the administrative corridor, the same hallway where Dr. Hargrove had once thrown a patient chart at her feet. The door was ajar. Voices leaked through: the hospital board president, 2 nursing directors, someone from risk management. They were discussing her file, her scope of practice violation, the paperwork that would make her termination permanent. And then the doors burst open. Jake O'Brien, 16 years old and carrying his father's shadow in his jawline, walked into that conference room with the careful stride of someone who'd been rehearsing this moment. His hands shook as he gripped a locked metal box, the kind used for documents, for secrets kept safe from the world. Behind him, Megan stood in the doorway, and every person at that table felt the air pressure change. "Mom said I should show you something," Jake said, and his voice didn't waver. He placed the box on the conference table with a click that sounded like a hammer striking steel. The hospital board president stared at it. "What is this?" "I found it in the attic. Mom didn't know I was looking." Jake's fingers worked the combination lock. 3 turns. The box opened to reveal 2 rows of medals arranged like soldiers standing at attention. Bronze stars catching the fluorescent light. Silver stars gleaming like tears frozen in place. Ribbons in colors nobody in that room recognized. Jake lifted a folded paper from inside the box, his voice steady now, the way soldiers' voices become steady when they're reading from something sacred. "Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy," he read. The silence was absolute. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something so heavy it crushed all other noise beneath it. A nursing director's pen fell from her hand and rolled across the table. The board president's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. One of the board members, a woman named Chen, who ran the compliance office, reached for a file that had been sitting in front of her, the one labeled O'Brien, M. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were citations. Ramadi. Fallujah. Baghdad. Actions under fire. Extraction under hostile conditions. Holding a position that should have been impossible to hold. "These are classified," she whispered. The door opened again. A gray-haired man in a charcoal suit stepped into the room, and Megan felt her son recognize the presence before she did, the way you recognize authority that has nothing to do with titles. His eyes moved to her for a fraction of a second, a nod so small only she could see it. Then he turned to the board. "I'm Commander James Paulson. I served with Senior Chief O'Brien in Baghdad. Ramadi as well." His voice was like an anchor dropping through water, settling into the seafloor of truth. 8 years ago, my team was conducting a classified operation in downtown Baghdad. The building we were using as a command post took a direct hit from an insurgent mortar. Structural failure. The roof was collapsing. He paused. The fluorescent lights hummed above them, a sound that suddenly seemed unbearably loud. There were 3 wounded Marines still inside. 2 of them couldn't walk. Senior Chief O'Brien held a support beam while my team extracted them. She held it for 4 minutes and 17 seconds while her shoulder was dislocated. "When we got her out," she said, "don't tell anyone. I promise my husband I'd disappear after this." The board president's face had gone the color of old institutional walls. The conference room door opened a 3rd time, and a woman in an FBI jacket stepped through, her credentials already in hand. Special Agent Rodriguez, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The mission in Baghdad was classified under National Security Directive 4427. The casualty event that occurred there involved civilian infrastructure. The classified status protected not just the operation but 12 families who were told their sons came home because of this woman's actions. She gestured toward Megan, who had not moved. "That's the truth. Everything before this moment was a lie designed to protect them." Rodriguez opened another file. "The investigation into Dr. Hargrove's conduct has revealed a pattern. 27 documented incidents of staff harassment over 18 years. 3 prior complaints that were never formally logged. One employee on medical leave for 6 months due to anxiety directly traceable to his behavior. Another transferred to a different hospital specifically to escape his supervision. She looked at each board member. The scope of practice charge against Senior Chief O'Brien was fabricated. The needle decompression procedure she performed is within the scope of practice for advanced trauma personnel. Dr. Hargrove knew this. He weaponized it anyway. Commander Paulson stepped forward. Senior Chief O'Brien saved my team. More than that, she saved an entire operation. I put in for decorations immediately after we rotated stateside. The recommendation went through official channels. He opened a leather case. Inside were 2 ribbons, one with a star, one silver. Bronze star. The board member beside Chen gasped. Silver star. The hospital president's hands were shaking. And a second silver star for her actions in Fallujah, 18 months prior. He paused. The silence stretched out like a taut cable about to snap. She also received the Navy Cross for her actions holding that beam. That was submitted 2 weeks after we got her out. The highest decoration an enlisted sailor can receive. 3 families wrote to me personally. They said their sons came home because she didn't leave them behind. Dr. Hargrove was not in the room. But he was watching the news that evening. The story had already gone to every major outlet in Portland. Hospital fires decorated war hero nurse. Investigation launched into emergency medicine chief. By the time he saw the headline, he was already halfway through a bottle of scotch in his office, the door locked, the lights off. His wife had called him at work. His teenage daughter had texted him screenshots of Reddit threads. His lawyer had sent an email saying only, "We need to talk." Not at the hospital. His phone began to ring. The hospital board president. The nursing director. The state medical board. Each call shorter than the last, each one a different flavor of catastrophe. His colleagues, the ones who'd laughed in the break room, the ones who'd applauded when he made his bet about Megan quitting, suddenly developed pressing appointments in other cities. The surgical residents who'd once jockeyed for position in his OR requested transfers. The nurses began answering his pages exactly 7 seconds after he hung up, no longer rushing to his side. By 3 a.m., his office felt like the inside of a tomb. 2 weeks later, security guard Wilson approached the chief of emergency medicine's office carrying an identical cardboard box. Wilson had delivered Megan's termination in that same box 1 month earlier. He placed it on Hargrove's desk with the same care he'd used before, then stepped back. "I believe you know the way out, sir," Wilson said. The tone was different this time. Not apologetic. Not deferential. Simply factual, the way you'd give someone directions to an exit they'd already known about but refused to acknowledge until now. Hargrove took the box. His hands did tremble, then. His hands did shake. He stood up from his desk, the desk that had held his position for 20 years, and walked past the nursing station where nobody looked up. The elevator doors opened. He got in. He left. By the next morning, the hospital had posted his position. 6 weeks later, Megan stood in the rose garden of the White House, her son beside her in his dress uniform, the one his mother's honor had made possible. The president shook her hand. Photographers captured the moment. Behind them, a Pentagon museum case held a pair of boots, the same boots she'd worn in Baghdad, covered in dust and dried blood and the weight of decisions that had saved lives. The plaque beneath read, "Carried 3 Marines to safety, never left them behind." Corporal Davis stood at attention in the 4th row, his uniform pressed sharp as a blade. He was still recovering. He would always be recovering. But he was alive because Megan had not hesitated during that night shift. Commander Paulson stood 2 rows back, his decorations gleaming in the afternoon light. The president spoke about declassified missions, about the cost of hidden service, about the families who had written letters saying thank you for bringing their sons home. Megan's eyes found her son. He was crying. For the first time, he understood why his mother had taken night shifts without complaint, why she'd worked double shifts and triple shifts, why she'd never talked about those 5 missing years. She'd been holding a beam. She'd been holding it for 8 years in civilian life, pretending to be something smaller than what she was. Meanwhile, in Portland, Dr. Hargrove taught CPR certification classes at a community college 3 nights a week, earning $42,000 a year. His medical license was under review. His name appeared in training videos about workplace harassment, a cautionary tale whispered about in hospital break rooms across the country. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid him. Nobody called him doctor anymore. But Megan had returned to Mercy General. She worked the same night shifts, the same emergency medicine unit where she'd corrected medication dosages and saved lives and tried to be invisible. Except now, when she walked past the nursing station, the younger nurses straightened their posture. They asked her questions. They watched her hands move during procedures, hands steady as surgical lasers, hands that had held lives together in ways most people would never understand. She trained new nurses in emergency protocols. She mentored surgical residents. She sat in meetings where her voice carried the weight of someone who had earned authority the hardest way possible, through sacrifice that nobody was supposed to know about. The fluorescent light still hummed above her. The monitors still beat their mechanical rhythms. The rain still fell on Portland in sheets that reminded her of Baghdad, of loss, of promises kept. On her drive home from Washington, she stopped at Marcus's grave. She placed her new commendation beside his headstone, the Navy Cross, the silver stars, the bronze star, the purple heart still boxed and ceremonial. She sat on the wet grass, rain beginning to fall again. I kept my head down as long as I could, she whispered to stone and weather. But some things are worth standing up for. The rain fell harder. Somewhere in the city, Dr. Hargrove was teaching CPR to civilians who didn't know his name. Somewhere in a Pentagon museum, her boot sat in a case under lights, a reminder of what one person could carry. And somewhere in the rose garden of the White House, a photograph existed showing a woman in dress uniform shaking hands with the President of the United States, finally visible, finally honored, finally home. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Leave a comment. Have you ever misjudged someone only to discover they were far greater than you imagined? Share this video with someone who needs to know that quiet strength still counts in a world obsessed with volume. Thank you for watching.